Yes.
Yeah, this is the cover of my book. And studies on happiness grew a lot in the past 25 years, thanks basically to the discovery of reliable methods to measure happiness. We have two kinds of measures: subjective measures like happiness or life satisfaction. And those are survey answers that people to give to survey questions on how happy they are or how they are satisfied with their lives. And then we use also objective data, as the spread of mental illnesses, of suicides, of psychiatric drugs, of addictions. And this data tell us something surprising, because especially in some countries, look at the US, these are 50 years of American history, and you see two curves in this graph, and the GDP per head grew enormously, but the share of Americans reporting to be very happy decreased. And objective data tell an even worse story. In the US, you have an epidemic of anxiety, depression, and mental illnesses in general grew so much. Look at this, in the past 15 years, suicides increased by 1/4. The share of psychiatrically medicated population is 20% in the US, 1 out of 5. And in Britain, it's not that better, because it's 1 out of 6. Very big numbers, but probably this is the most impressive, the epidemic of addictions. In the US, 2.5 million cases of opioid abuse in 2015. In 2016, about 60,000 people died for overdose. This is more than the total number of soldiers who died in the entire Vietnam War, which lasted more than 10 years. In just 1 year, more people died in the US for opioid abuse than in the entire Vietnam War. These are numbers of really big and widespread ill-being. And look at this. This is the time trend of drug overdoses, which grew enormously in the past 15 years, even if they started from a very high level. And look at this, China. It's not only a rich country that can experience disappointing effects of economic growth on happiness. In China, between 1990 and 2007, average life satisfaction fell more than 7%. Those years are the years of golden economic growth in China. GDP per capita grew by more than 10% in this period, but life satisfaction fell sharply. And China is not the only case among poor countries. Look at India, the other Asian economic miracle. Over the same period, a period of very lively economic growth, life satisfaction fell by more than 7%. So these are all examples of quickly growing countries. The US is a country which grows more among industrial countries, and India and China are the countries who grow more among poor countries. It is not a general rule, the decline of well-being. Look at Europe. From the late 70s from the mid 70s to the late 2000s, life satisfaction grew in Europe. But in some countries, it decreased. And those countries are very prominent examples of economic growth. So why? Economic growth brought us very important things, as access to consumer goods, which people crave very strongly. Look at those people in the picture. They are not homeless. They are camping out for a new iPhone. And economic growth gave us very important things, as longer lives, we live longer. But something seemed to have gone wrong with happiness at all ages. Children teenagers, middle-aged, elderly. We have problems at all ages in some industrial countries, and in general, even in Europe, where life satisfaction grew, it grew very weakly. So in general, the impact of economic growth on subjective well-being, on happiness, has been disappointing. So why? That was a question. What do we know from the studies on happiness? Do money matter? Yes, a little, and mostly a low income level, but it matters a little. It makes some difference in happiness, even if this difference is lower than previously thought. But many other things matter for happiness, but we have a very important one, a prominent one, which is relationships. This is the greater impact, the greatest that we have on happiness. That's really what matters. And from this point of view, we did some studies on the decline of happiness with Francesco Saracino, on the decline of happiness in China, India, and the US, and we found common patterns. Economic growth is not a problem, it's not the problem. It had a positive effect on happiness, even this effect is not that big, but as people with more money are somehow happier, so economic growth improved happiness, but this improvement was more than offset by some negative impacts, basically to the decline of social capital and the increasing importance in people's lives of social comparisons. I'll give you an intuitive idea of what social comparisons are. Look at this, this image. I think it is intuitive, but this is even more intuitive. This gloomy glance, the gloomy glance of this kid is because his friend has a bigger ice cream. Or look at this pictures. She's Sophia Loren, one of the most beautiful women ever, but her gloomy glance is because there's someone having something more than her. And this picture is interesting because it shows that there's no limit to social comparison. You can have a lot, but if someone has something more, this a lot can seem little. And then the other problem, so the problem is that social comparison became much more important in people's lives in all these countries, in China, in India, and in the US. And then the other contributing factor to the decline of happiness was the decline of relationships. In the US, loneliness has become a mass problem. 1/4 of Americans have no one to share their confidences with, and this share becomes 1/2 of Americans if family members are not counted. From 50 to 30% of the general population, loneliness has become a chronic state. 80% of people under 18 feel lonely, and 40% of individuals over 65 years feel lonely. Families has turned to be increasingly unstable. Americans divorce more, marry less, they live together less, separate more. It is a society that has developed enormous problems in building stable relationships. Generational cleavage is another extreme problem in the US, very tense relationships between different generations. Kids and teens on one side and adults on the other have very difficult relationships. Trust declined, as well as solidarity, honesty, social participation, civic engagement. The relationships among friends, family members, neighbors reduced in quantity and lost quality. So that's the basic problem. The message from these studies is that it is very difficult to improve well-being, even in a context of economic growth, if the price of economic growth is to reduce society to a desert. to destroy connections among people, because connections are the most important thing, single contributor to people's happiness. Look at how strong was the decline of trust among Americans since the 70s. And in China, those phenomena are very similar. The number of one-member families doubled in just 10 years. And between 1990 and 2007, married population decreased by 16%, trust decreased by 11%, associational activity by 20%, and Indian figures are similar, not that better. In China, we observe the same upsurge in the importance of social comparisons, as well as in India. So basically, the image I'm giving of those countries is very different from the one people is used to, because those countries are usually taken as positive examples. I live in Europe, where many people consider that the US are the example to follow, the most advanced and progressive country. But I give you an image of countries which are experiencing a very deep social crisis. People are losing connections, relationships, happiness. They're also losing time, because people in all these countries, work hours increased. So these are symptoms of a very deep social crisis. So why so many people tell that these countries are the examples to follow? The answer is in the fascination of economic growth, because those countries grow quickly, quicker than other industrial and industrializing countries. And the interesting question is there a relationship between social crisis on one side and economic dynamism on the other? And my answer is positive. This answer is based on the theory of defensive growth put forward by my co-authors and I. I'll try to give you an intuitive explanation of this idea. Here you see two images. So one is an image of loneliness, the other one is of environmental degradation. And these are two common goods, relationships and environment. And the point is, how will people react to a decline in relationships and a decline in the quality of the environment? And my answer is trying to make money. I'll give you some examples. Imagine that the city where you live in becomes too dangerous to go out at night, or that your network of friends disappear. Nobody has no longer time. You call people and they don't want to go out. So you have to spend your nights at home. And in order to have pleasant nights, you fill up your home with all kinds of home entertainment. Home entertainment is a costly and private good, but a livable city and a network of friends are common goods and free goods. So in this way, you substitute something which was free with something which is costly. I'll give you another example. Think of the elderly. Now, when our elderly are sick and lonely, we usually buy them a caregiver. Before, there was a neighborhood, social fabric in the neighborhoods who took care of the elderly. Someone went to meet them, someone did them shopping. Now the social fabric in the neighborhoods doesn't exist anymore, and we need a caregiver. The caregiver is a private and costly good. A network of neighbors is a free good. Think of the infancy. I belong to a generation which grew up in the streets. I spent all my afternoons when I was young in the streets, and no child does it anymore, because cities has become dangerous for children, because of cars. So now children grow up in their homes. They socialize through screens. We socialize through people. It makes a big difference. And this created much more costly childhoods. We need a lot of money for babysitters, a lot of money for toys to fill up their loneliness, the empty of their lives. So children's experience has become poorer from the social point of view and much more costly, because babysitters and toys are private and costly goods which substitute for a common good, a livable city for children. I can go, think of the environment, it's the same example. If the sea or the river close to your home becomes too polluted to swim in, you can buy a ticket to a tropical resort, which is costly, and the river is free. So basically, when what we have in common declines, we need money. And this money creates expenditures. But in order to finance these expenditures, we have to work more, to compete more, and in this way, we create GDP growth. We create economic growth, which in turn can further decrease social capital, relationships, and environment. We consume more, produce more, then we pollute more our environment. We use more our car. We work more, we take less care of our relationships, we worsen the quality of our cities. So it can happen that greater economic growth means worse relationships. This is a vicious circle in which people react to the poverty of what they have in common by trying to make money, but more money further worsen the quality of their common goods. And the result of this, this is called defensive growth, because these expenditures are defensive. I buy home entertainment to defend myself by the degradation of my city. I buy toys to compensate for the loneliness of my kids. These are all defensive actions. So my idea is that economic growth can depend by defensive purchases that people do to defend themselves by the decline of common goods, but these expenditures feed the decline of common goods. So the result is this. These are equations, because these are mathematical models, but of course there's no time for this. And this is the result of this, a world of private wealth, the world we created, faced by the poverty of what we have in common. And the other face of relational poverty is social comparisons, because a study we are doing with Francesco shows that people more lonely and with more conflictual relationships are much more inclined to social comparisons. What I mean is basically that loneliness and poor relationships are fertile ground for envy, because envy is the source of social comparisons. The social comparisons and poor relationships are two faces of the same coin. Look at this. This is an example from again, from the US economy. The dimension of the sector of security and social control in the US. This is the time series of the share of work supervisors and guards on the total labor force. Guards are police, correction officials, and security personnel. So this is a measure of the dimension of the disciplinary apparatus of the society. These are all people that work to control someone else somehow. So in 1948, this share was about 10% of the total workforce. In 1996, it remained stable in 1966. But then in the late 70s, it began to grow. And in 2002, it was almost 18% of the workforce. This means that almost an American out of 5 is working to control someone else. This is an unbelievable dimension of the disciplinary apparatus of the society. It's unparalleled in any other country, unprecedented in history, and it created the other face of these numbers are the unbelievable dimension of the US jail population, which raised from 200,000 inmates from in the 1970s to more than 2 million since the 2000s. This is an unprecedented number of jailed people in practice in human history. The only historical examples with similar incarceration rates are the USSR of Stalin and the China of Mao during the Cultural Revolution. Look at this. This is the international comparisons of work supervisors, just work supervisors. In the US, the share of work supervisors on the total labor force is around 15%. The only country with a similar share is the United Kingdom, but in continental Europe, all countries have much smaller shares. I'm showing you these numbers because these numbers are the reaction to the decline in trust. When people do not trust each other, they pay someone else to monitor the persons that are not trusted. So this is a good example of my basic message. To live in a society where relationships become poor and conflictual is, first of all, extremely costly. And all these costs feed GDP because all this guard labor in the US, well, they are all paid people. Their incomes are counted in national statistics. They feed American GDP. They contributed greatly to American economic growth. But this is an example of a kind of expenditures that are a reaction to the decline of social capital, in particular the decline of trust. Other sectors are boosted by the decline of social capital, as the sector of the home entertainment, which was a driving force of American growth in the past few decades, or the industry of vacations, which is an industry of evasion from the unlivable environments that we created in our cities. So I've been speaking about the decline of relationships and the increase of and the decline of happiness. And these phenomena are not present in all countries. For instance, in Europe, relationships and happiness did not decline in the past few decades. So why in some countries they decline? What is the driving force? And the answer is in materialistic values. This is a topic widely studied by social psychologists with quantitative studies. And materialistic values are defined as giving a high priority in life to extrinsic motivations such as money, consumption, success, and giving a low priority to intrinsic motivation such as having good relationships, pro-social behavior in general. And the problem is that the more materialistic people are, and the less they're happy, they have greater symptoms of, in general, they have less frequent positive emotions and more frequent negative emotions. They have a much higher risk of mental illnesses and also a higher risk of physical illnesses. For instance, materialistic people are at greater risk of cardiovascular diseases. And moreover, materialistic people have worse relationships. They are less generous, less empathic, less cooperative. They tend more to instrumental friendships, cynicism. They tend to be distrustful of others. So The problem is that this kind of values, materialistic values, enormously spread in the US. We have huge evidence on this. Instead, they did not grow in Europe. So the growth in materialism in the US greatly contributed to the worsening of relationships and the diminution of happiness. Why did materialism grow in the US? There are several reasons. One is advertising. All studies on advertising show that advertising has a very huge power of increasing people's materialistic values. To summarize all these studies, I choose simply some sentences of ad people, because everything I've been saying, it is very clear to them. Look at this sentence from a very famous French advertiser. I'm an ad man. In my line of work, nobody wants you to be happy, because happy people do not buy. They know perfectly what I'm saying. Or look at this. She's American, an advertiser for children. She says that advertising at its best, it's making people feel that without a product, they are a loser. Look at the keywords: loser, happy people do not consume. The goal of advertising is to create dissatisfaction, is to make people feel that they will feel better. They will solve their problems if they buy. And in order to buy, they must be dissatisfied. This has been very clear from the beginning of advertising. In the 1920s, a manager of General Motors declared that the mission of business is the organized creation of dissatisfaction. In the 1920s, advertising began to exist. And since its very beginning, its keywords were this kind of keywords, creating dissatisfaction. So it is an engine for well-being, for ill-being. And advertising in the past decades have been increasingly targeting children and teens. The advertising expenditure now is 150 times greater than it was in the 1980s. And this generates a soaring materialism among children. 75% of American children want to get rich, the highest share in the world. And children who are more exposed to advertising are more materialistic and, exactly as adults, less happy and with poorer relationships. So how to change all this? How can we stop the defensive growth mechanism? The core of my book is the therapies for this, which I identify in policies for social capital. I'll give you some hints on this. Let's begin with policies for advertising. In Sweden, TV ads targeting children under 12 are forbidden. They are banned. And TV programs targeting children cannot be longer than half an hour per day. The principle is that children do not have to spend their time in front of TV. And these kind of regulations are shared by many other countries in Europe. Well, not that many, to tell you the truth, but there are some other examples. So these examples should be extended. We should ban ads targeting children, and in general, we should reduce TV programs targeting kids. And moreover, as advertising is bad also for adults, the total amount, the total burden of advertising should be reduced. And a very easy way is a very heavy taxation on advertising. This is the easiest part of my program. Then I go to a more complicated issue, schools. Sorry. What do we learn at school? We learn many things which are written in the programs and many other things which are written nowhere, but they are not less important. First of all, we learn that, well, people goes to school when they are 6 in most countries, and they have to sit, at least in Italy, for 5 hours per day, at least. To sit for five hours for a 6 years old child, well, you can find the word for me, it is between torture and maltreatment, because it is inconsistent with their well-being. They cannot be happy and be sitting 5 hours per day. So the message that schooling sends them, the first message, is you're not here to have a good time. You're here to perform. Performing is something, having a good time is something different. And they, of course, children deeply interiorize this message, because this is the first contact that they have with a human institution, and they are learning the rules of the game. And the first rule of the game, you're not here to be happy. But this is inconsistent with good academic achievement, because happiness is the key to good learning. Instead, schools are a factory of anxiety. 50% of students are anxious, even if they are well prepared. 2/3 of students feel stress about poor grades. This is an engine of stress, frustration, dissatisfaction, which is not justified by academic achievements, because it doesn't work. Studies show that students learn better when they're happier. Moreover, schooling is a schooling of materialism. Basically, schooling suggests to students that intrinsic motivations are unimportant. We ask students to go to school not because it is important, intrinsically important, because it is worth, but because they will have a better job, they will avoid social exclusion. So all these motivations are extrinsic, because are external to the activity of studying. We never say them, go to school because it is a nice activity, will make you a better person. No, go to school because you will have some external reward. In this way, we create materialistic students. But again, this is counterproductive from the point of view of academic achievements, because studies show that intrinsic motivations are the key to good test scores. And then schooling is a school of relationships. We teach people to compete. Why do we do that? The underlying belief is that competition, sorry, I have a missing sentence from the slide. Competition raises standards. The idea is that the worst performing students will try to imitate the best performing students, and the result of this will be a higher average standard, and this is wrong, because comparisons undermine self-esteem. Studies show that students with bad scores in the tests develop low self-esteem, which traps them into a schooling experience in which they think they're not good students, and this will keep them into poor academic performance for all their schooling career. The problem is that self-confidence, and not peer pressure, is the key to learning. And then schooling only teaches cognitive intelligence. The focus is totally on cognitive intelligence, as if it was the only thing that mattered. But studies show that successful lives, flourishing lives, are much more affected by emotional intelligence than cognitive intelligence. It's more important for living well. So the idea, the reason why we mostly exclude emotional intelligence from schooling is that cognition and emotions are in conflict. And this idea dates back to positivism of the late 19th century. The idea that good cognition required the exclusion of any emotion from cognitive activity. But this idea is totally outdated. We know now that cognition and emotion reinforce each other, and that people learn much better when they associate their learning to positive emotions. So it doesn't work. Then, schooling is entirely focused on tests and performance. It's the only thing that matters. But we know from studies that this destroys critical and original thinking, and that haste has a similar effect on students. So basically, schooling is doing many wrong things. A very famous viral video on YouTube on schooling shows similar pictures. It says, this is a telephone from 100 years ago, and this is a modern day telephone. Big difference, right? This is a car from 100 years ago, and this is a modern day car. Big difference. This is a classroom from 100 years ago, and this is a modern day classroom. No difference. Nothing has changed in 1 century. And the bad news is that we know that this doesn't work. But the good news is that we know perfectly what works. In particularly, participatory teaching works. Participatory teaching is this: students work in group on common projects and ask teachers questions. In this kind of classroom, the central relationships is between the students. It is opposed to vertical teaching, where teachers primarily lecture and ask, are the teachers that ask students questions, and students mostly take notes and read textbooks. In this kind of classroom, the central relationship is between the teacher and the students. And a very big study by Algan and others showed that participatory teaching practices promote cooperation with other students and with teachers, membership in association, trust, participation in civil society, self-esteem. It works much better in all these aspects. And moreover, people feel happier in nations where participatory teaching prevailed. So this is something to do. An extreme form of participatory teaching is Montessori schooling, which has 1 century of history, and it's a kind of schooling where there are no tests, and it devotes a lot of attention to develop social, emotional intelligence. And Montessori children are better even in standardized reading and math tests, even if they never did the test, because this kind of schooling has no tests and no scores. They interact more positively when they play. They have higher social cognition and control, much greater concern for fairness and justice. They write more creatively. So we know what kind of schooling works much better. And we know in which direction we should go. Cities. For 5,000 years, cities have been a place where, to gather people together, for making people meet, until cars arrived, because this changed everything. The problem is that the social fabric in the cities is created in the common spaces, squares, streets, where people meet, where neighbors know each other, where social fabric is created. But when common spaces are occupied by cars instead than by persons, then this all changes. There's a very famous urbanist which said that in a city, It is impossible to put at easy at the same time cars and persons. You have to make a choice. And the choice we made is to put at easy cars. And this destroyed social relationships. Everybody suffers from this situation, but the main victims are kids and the elderly, because they need a social fabric at working distance for having the relationships, and cars made all this impossible. So these are the most disadvantaged population groups. This sentence is the conclusion of a British report on the condition of children. One generation ago, 10 years old had more freedom than a teenager does today. In a single generation, the radius of activity of children declined by 90%. The radius of activity is the space around home where children are allowed to go unsupervised. And it reduced by 90%. And in 40 years, the share of students walking to school decreased from 41% to 13%. And this 13% now goes to school by car. With their parents. Well, before they went walking. So they weren't walking alone. And these are data from the US, but those from Europe are similar. And the consequences are an epidemic of obesity among children, because they don't move anymore, they don't do any physical activity, and more importantly, relational deprivation. Because children now do not have very few social relationships. They don't have those gangs that children of my generation experienced, and that those experiences gave us the opportunity to develop those social skills that would accompany us for all our lives. And there's new urbanism is a stream of urban studies that underlies the shortcomings of car dependence, and underlies that where cars plays a less dominant role, people are happier and have greater social capital. So the model of city we should organize is with high residential density, as opposed to low density suburbs, typical of American cities, which should be plenty of pedestrian areas, parks, sports centers, streets should be walkable, and private circulation of cars should be strongly restricted. Transport should be mostly public or based on cycling. If you go to see how cities as Amsterdam or Copenhagen are organized, you will see a concrete example of this kind of urban organization, and this created very sociable cities. Healthcare. Look at this impressive progression of the share of healthcare spending on GDP, on American GDP. In 11 years, it passed from 13.8 to almost 18%. Now it's more than 19%. This means that $2 out of 10, which are spent in the US, are spent on health, on healthcare, which is an enormous number and unparalleled in other countries, even if this share is growing also in European countries. Here you see France, Germany, Italy, and UK, where also the share of healthcare spending on GDP grew, even if it is much lower, it's around 10%. But people think that all this money is well spent, because healthcare is giving us very important things. It's giving us more time. People, everybody knows that longevity has been increasing for a long time in industrial countries. So now we have these images of happy elderly, happy and healthy elderly, but health is not improving. Look at this data. It's just an example. Italy, in 13 years, life expectancy from 1995 to 2008 increased by 4 years, justifying all this picture of happy elderly, but healthy life expectancy dropped by 5 years for men and 9 years for women. So probably this is just an example shared by many other countries. What I mean is that the increase in life expectancy, in longevity, does not mean that health is improving. People are living longer, but are not living better. So probably these pictures should be substituted by these pictures, because look at this. These are healthy life years at birth, and in the figure are compared figures for from 2010 and 2015. 2015 is the yellow bar, and in many cases it is shorter than the blue bar. So healthy life is decreasing in many countries, and because the problem is that we are creating an army of chronically ill people. People live longer, but live many years with chronic diseases. Excuse me. Sorry for the interruption. Another popular answer that people would give to the question on how to improve people's health is spend more on health care. And it is another wrong answer. Look at this graph. I'm sorry the names of the countries are in Italian, but I guess you can read it. The graph, on the horizontal axis, we have the per capita expenditures on healthcare in these countries, public plus private expenditures. And on the vertical axis, we have longevity in years. And you see that there's no relationship. It is not true that countries that spend more on healthcare obtain better results on longevity, which is not a good indicator of health, but even this indicator is unrelated to healthcare spending, because healthcare spending is just one of the elements that affects health. The most important element is happiness. Studies from epidemiologists show that ill-being and stress are very important risk factors for health. They affect all diseases, all kinds of diseases, from cancer to cardiovascular diseases to to much lighter problems as the cold. People more unhappy have a higher risk of getting a cold. This is true for all population groups, and it is especially true for the elderly. The most important predictor of happiness, I told you before, is the quality of relationships, and the quality of relationships is very important in predicting health also. Again, we have a very strong effect on the elderly on this. Older adults who are socially isolated are at greater risk of cardiovascular diseases, dementia, memory loss, Alzheimer's disease, and all-cause mortality. This is just an example from the old population group. But this kind of, in general, social isolation, poor relationships, and unhappiness increase morbidity and mortality for all population groups. We have a very interesting research has been carried on by some Harvard students, which followed entire lives. They follow a sample of people for 75 years, generations of researchers. And the conclusions of this research are good relationships keep people happier and healthier. Happiness is love, full stop. and loneliness is a killer. These are sentences from some of the various directors of this research. So my conclusion is that promoting happiness means promoting health, and that the healthcare system is somehow the end station of the stress. All the stress tends to translate into health problems before or later. So in order to limit this explosion of healthcare spending, I showed you that healthcare spending is running out of control. Well, we should focus on prevention, but prevention should be done outside the healthcare system by focusing on policies for relationships. Especially loneliness is a very important risk factor. I showed you before that loneliness is unevenly distributed across generations. Young and old people have the highest risk of loneliness. And so tackling loneliness in old age is a priority for reducing healthcare demand over the medium term, and prevention over the very long term requires tackling loneliness among young people. Among children, it would be very important. So, I'm concluding. Do I have still time, Laura? So I'm concluding.
Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Look at this. This is the satisfaction that, on average, people have for their job. It is the flat curve. And the increasing curve is an index of wages in the US. So as wages were growing, job satisfaction was not. And studies on the determinants of job satisfaction explain why, because job satisfaction increases with the quality of relationships on the job, the perception of control over one's work, the opportunity to express one's ability, and the variety of tasks carried out. Also wage matters, also salaries, but all this list that you see in the slide, it's all a list of intrinsic motivations. So the problem is that not only extrinsic motivations make job satisfaction, I mean salary, but also intrinsic motivations matter, but the evolution of work of organization within companies in the past few decades probably worsened all these aspects related to intrinsic motivations. And this is why job satisfaction did not increase. This is an image of the relationships between, which are often experienced within companies, which can be very tense and conflictual. And look at this data that I found impressive. Look at the last column on Europe. This is the share of employees which are engaged, not engaged, and actively disengaged. Engaged are 14%, not engaged 2/3, and actively disengaged are a higher share than engaged. This is an enormous waste of work, energies, and capacity. All this disengagement, which is the consequence of very low job satisfaction. So what should we do to increase job satisfaction? Well, first to redesign the content of work processes to make them more interesting. And there are very interesting experiments and experiences in this, and they work. Increase the degree of discretion and autonomy of workers, increase the compatibility between work and other aspects of life to improve the work-life balance, and reduce the aspects of work, reduce stress, pressure, controls, incentives. Economists say that this would increase productivity, because their idea is usually that only extrinsic motivations matter for work activity. So if you don't put pressure on people, they will not be efficient on their work. But studies on organization do not confirm this belief, because they show that workers who are more happy on their work are more and not less productive. So many firms are understanding this, and they are changing their work organization. We have many examples of very successful firms in which the work organization is based on respect of people's needs, on treating persons as persons and not as personal, on giving them intrinsic motivations and taking care of their well-being on the work. So, and this work, and there's those kind of companies are profitable, stable. There are many important examples among big and medium and small firms. So again, all my proposals are not utopia. They somehow they are realized in some place and in some time. It can work. What I'm trying to do is to put together a variety of experiences which are connected by greater attention to human relationships and human well-being, and to connect all these different experiences in various fields of social and economic life, to connect them into a single project of humanization of the society and of the economic activity. Basically, my message is that we're not producing a world of happier people, despite the enormous opportunity to improve happiness provided by economic prosperity. But we are not producing happier people simply because the world is not organized for this purpose. Social and economic organization is motivated by other purposes. For instance, schooling is aimed at the labor market. It's not aimed at improving happiness and relationships of people. Simply, we should take into account that any decision we take has an impact on relationships, big and small decisions. But we never decide basing on the impact of our choices on relationships. We decide based on other criteria. If we want to improve people's happiness, we should simply change the criteria on the basis of which we make our social and economic choices, happiness and relationships. So after if I have another minute, I will finish with some questions on our democracy. Democracy was invented to make ordinary people participate to public life, because before democracy, public decisions were taken by a close elite. So participation is the key word. But the problem is that if this still works, because some people says that, look at this, they say, for instance, that corporate capitalism is not democracy. Are they right? According to very prominent political scientists, they're right. They say that the current phase of democracy shouldn't be called democracy, should be called post-democracy, because we have regressed to a pre-democratic situation in which decisions are taken, political decisions are taken by closed elites, economic elites in particular. Big business has a disproportionate influence of political decisions. This is the meaning of the word post-democracy. And the reason why democracy have transformed into post-democracy is money, because electoral campaigns have run out of any control. If you look at the costs of electoral campaigns in industrial country, it is growing since many decades at a very fast pace. So political parties need a lot of money for their political activity and for elections. And from where money comes from? Of course, from big business. They're excellent financiers. And this made political parties extremely sensible to their needs. There are several things that we can do to change this situation. Those political scientists give many suggestions to reduce the dependency of political parties from money. I'm no time to enter this question because it's complicated, so I'll conclude here. But this is a crucial question because many of the reforms I'm proposing will hit very important and big interests. For instance, if we want cities with less cars, the automotive industry will be hit. If we want a healthcare system which is less costly, the big pharma will be hit. Their interests will be hit. So one of the reasons for this very costly organization of our society is that it's a kind of organization which is supported by very important interests which have deep influence on political decisions. To change post-democracy is very important in order to achieve a more happy and connected world. And if you look at the trend of the confidence in Congress in the US, it increased enormously across the past 40 years. And when the political system gets so discredited, some big change happens, as it happened. So these are some covers of my book in several languages. After blaming so much advertising, I give you some advertising. This is a Japanese cover, and many thanks for your attention.
Yeah, thank you, Stefano. It was really interesting, and obviously it would be nice to spend maybe an entire class on all of what you have. You had some equations early on. Those are equations that are explained in your book?
Yes, those equations are explained in my book, but they are very difficult to understand for non-economists. These are economic models, and my book is written for a wider audience. It should be accessible also to non-academic economists.
Okay.
So these equations are in a box for economists within my book.
Okay, so those people who watch this in the future and are interested in those equations can both get your book, and they can also reach out to you for greater information about those equations. Would you put the screen on those equations so that we can, and so that people can see those?
Yeah.
Got it. Scroll back quickly.
I'll find it out.
Yes, and so we'll be posting this on the ISQOLS YouTube site. There, beautiful, thank you. We'll be posting this on the YouTube ISQOLS site. And Stefano, you will be one of the speakers at the right? That's right, Joe? One of the speakers at the upcoming ISQOLS.
Yes, in Granada, in next ISQOLS conference. Yeah.
Right, and then you will be on our panel, the Happiness Alliance, Happiness and Public Policy panel at the OECD World Forum quite soon in Korea. I'm delighted that you'll be joining our panel there, Stefano. So, Francesco, did you want to add anything to this? I know you're one of the co-authors with Stefano.
No, I think that Stefano has illustrated with plenty of details his work, which I had the pleasure and the honor to contribute at this part. So no, I would leave the floor to any questions from the public if there are any.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for joining. And I think that we had some issues with timing. So we send right now an apology to those of you who signed up for the webinar and are probably going to be tuning in 45 minutes So we'll do our best to get this up and running so that people will be able to see it as soon as they can. And we apologize to you, Stefano, for the issue of timing and registration. Yeah, so really, really appreciate this work. And there are lots of questions that I think it would be really wonderful to have maybe another discussion on, of what is it going to take to get governments and communities to adopt these policies, and what are some of the examples. Hopefully we'll realize this, these goals that we have, because the opposite is pretty dreary. So, thank you so much.
Thank you, Stefano. That was wonderful. Thank you so much for your time and that excellent presentation.
Yeah, many thanks to you.
Okay.
Everybody.
Thanks for the work you're doing. All right, we'll stop recording now.